How do you think our relationship with China will change under a new administration?
You know, it's difficult to say, of course. The Chinese-United States relationship is a very complex one that goes well beyond the FCC's boundaries. But I think what you see now is a general recognition that the Chinese Communist Party has a very determined view about the way that it wants to order the world. It's not content to simply focus internally. Now we see them exporting some of their own values abroad. And yes, I've mentioned on Twitter quite frequently, for example, the fact that if they're willing to take action to cause censorship on things like basketball and flag emojis or games, what will it mean if they're from equipment based from Chinese manufacturers and subject to Chinese law is then incorporated into our communications networks? And you see a growing recognition. I think the FCC has spoken with a bipartisan voice. We see people on Capitol Hill speaking with a bipartisan voice as recently as this week, when they passed legislation saying that we need to think about open radio access networks solutions as a way of navigating around some of the problems that we've seen with Huawei and ZTE.
Do you think the stance on Huawei and ZTE will change under the next administration, under the next FCC? And if not, how do you see it changing?
All I can say is that thus far, the FCC has spoken with a unified bipartisan voice. And when you think about it, that makes sense. Whether it's a 5G network being built in New York City or in Navajo Nation, everybody wants that to be secure. That's not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. When it comes to making sure that we provide the funding necessary for smaller carriers to be able to remove this equipment, there too, Congress has not seen a partisan affiliation. And so I think that the recognition of the Chinese Communist Party as a threat in this area, the recognition of the threat that Huawei and ZTE in particular can pose, and the recognition that we all need to work together, Congress and the executive branch and independent agencies, is something they think speaks very well about the unity on this issue.
At the same time, your FCC also ended the most direct FCC regulation of broadband networks, which some would say undermined their security. How does the FCC work to ensure that broadband networks remain secure under this new framework?
I would argue completely to the contrary. The decision we made to remove utility-style regulation has been a fantastic benefit to the American people. Since we made that decision back in 2017 to remove those net neutrality utility-style regulations, speeds in the United States have doubled with respect to fixed broadband. Millions more Americans have access to the internet. And over the last 8 months of the pandemic, what is notable is that even as millions of people are moving home and increasing the demand on the internet, the networks have been architected in such a way to sustain all of that traffic. In fact, fixed and mobile broadband speeds have increased during the pandemic. That would not have happened if we had utility-style regulation. The best evidence of that is Europe. Europe has that utility-style regulation that some net neutrality advocates love. And Thierry Breton, one of the European commissioners, had to go hand in hand to YouTube and Netflix and other streaming services at the beginning of the pandemic and ask them to proactively throttle content to video consumers from HD to SD, because they had not had the infrastructure investment that gave the European Union confidence that the networks would hold up. That's not something we've seen here in the United States. And I would argue that there's also a big benefit when it comes to security. Companies now have, because they have certainty in terms of building these networks, now they have the luxury of thinking, okay, now we need to think about security of those networks as well as the business case for building them in the first place.
Your decision on net neutrality spawned thousands of public comments, protests in the streets, that John Oliver segment where he was arguing in opposition to the decision that your FCC made. What is it like to make a decision that feels so unpopular?
You know, I think the key is to have the courage of your convictions. And I knew when we went down this path, there would be an outcry. I mean, no doubt about it. This has been a hot button issue since well before I got to the FCC. But at the end of the day, I think the wisdom on this issue was drawn from Gandalf, who in The Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, as you might remember, says to Frodo, that is not for you to choose. All that is left for you to choose is what to do with the time that is given to you. I knew it was the right decision, and I knew that time would vindicate that decision. And sure enough, here we are 3 years later. And now when you go on Twitter or you go on other social media platforms and read about net neutrality, some of the people are wondering, whatever happened with that issue? I was promised the internet was going to die, yet here we are tweeting. And it's useful to go look at those predictions. I mean, the Senate Democratic Caucus promised us in February of 2018 that if we got rid of these regulations, you would get the internet one word at a time. CNN proclaimed that this was the end of the internet as we know it. Bernie Sanders said the same thing. And so I think all of these hyperbolic claims of destruction and death and woe and whatnot have all fallen by the wayside. And in fact, we have an internet economy that is stronger than ever, that is delivering better value than ever for American consumers. And ultimately, I think the market-based framework, the bipartisan framework that started under President Clinton and continued for the first 6 years of President Obama, that market-based framework we restored is the right one for the American consumer.
That said, it's likely that the next FCC will try to undo a lot of what you accomplished in your tenure, and bringing back net neutrality is top of the list. I'm curious how you reflect on that as you look back on the years and look ahead to Inauguration Day.
Well, we have done an incredible job, I think, on executing on the core parts of our agenda, closing the digital divide, advancing American leadership in 5G, making sure that we benefit consumers in terms of proactive enforcement on things like robocalls, and things like addressing markets that have for some people have fallen through the cracks. And for example, regulating the rates that inmates pay when they call people on the outside. And so those are the kinds of things that we've executed on. And I would argue that none of them know a necessarily party line affiliation. Again, as I mentioned, even net neutrality, that was a market-based framework that started under President Clinton. His FCC chairman made the courageous and correct decision, I think, not to subject telecom networks at the dawn of the commercial internet to heavy-handed regulation. That was the right decision for the internet economy. So I hope that the key decisions that we've made will be seen similarly in the decades to come. And especially when you think about some of the emerging technologies that we have encouraged, non-geostationary satellite orbit constellations like SpaceX and OneWeb, pushing out a ton more unlicensed spectrum for Wi-Fi, a 5x increase in mid-band spectrum over the last year or so. I mean, it's just been incredible some of the things we've been able to do, and we've done it generally in a bipartisan way. So notwithstanding some of the hot button issues that some people might know about, the lesson to take away is that this FCC has moved aggressively and on a consensus basis to deliver value for the American people.
With the Biden administration incoming, you're expected to follow longstanding tradition, which means stepping down before Inauguration Day, but you don't actually have to, and you could stay on as a commissioner. What are your plans?
Well, my plans right now are, as you might have seen from my blog post yesterday, just to make sure we have a successful December meeting. We have a lot of very meaty items teed up, and otherwise to do the bread and butter work of the FCC. We have a big C-band auction coming up on December 8th. This is going to be the largest 5G auction of mid-band spectrum ever in the United States. We've already gotten a lot of great bidders, and I think it's going to be very successful. So yeah, I know there's a process for the election certification, the GSA ascertainment, all those processes are going to play out, but I'm going to focus on what's right in front of me, which is my job leading this great agency and the tremendous career staff that have allowed us to deliver so much productive value for the American consumer.